Nobody said it out loud. Nobody needed to. Because the moment Caitlin Clark stepped back onto that court, something shifted. Not just in the gym, not just on the stat sheet, but in how the entire future of Team USA suddenly looked. This was supposed to be a return, a check-in, a slow ramp-up after months away from the game. Instead, it turned into a message. One that landed harder than anyone expected. And while Caitlin was reminding the world who she is, someone else's name kept coming up, even though she wasn't there. Paige Bueckers. No comments. No interviews. No reaction clips. But in basketball, silence can be louder than anything else. And once you understand what really happened inside that camp, the frustration people started whispering about makes a lot more sense. Because this wasn't about embarrassment. It was about timing. And timing is ruthless. But to understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to rewind. 5 months. That's how long Caitlin Clark had been away from real, competitive basketball before walking into Team USA camp. 5 months of rehab. 5 months of questions. 5 months where even supporters quietly wondered if her body would ever feel the same again. The public narrative was careful, respectful, almost cautious. She'll need time. Let's see how she looks. No pressure, just a return. That's how this was framed. Inside the camp, the expectations weren't much different. Coaches weren't looking for dominance. They were looking for signs, movement, rhythm, comfort. What they got instead was control. From the first serious stretches of play, Caitlin didn't look like someone easing back. She looked like someone who never left. Her pace was sharp. Her reads were instant. Her presence changed how the floor felt. And that's the thing casual viewers miss. Elite players don't just score. They reorganize the game. Defenders reacted differently the moment she crossed half court. Teammates cut harder. Bigs ran the floor faster. Shooters spaced wider. Not because they were told to, but because they trusted what was coming next. And it became clear very quickly. This wasn't a comeback story. It was a reminder. But reminders have consequences, especially when there's already another star fighting for space in the same future. And that's where comparisons crept back in. Paige Bueckers and Caitlin Clark have been tied together for years now. Long before Team USA camps. Long before professional debates. Even before the spotlight got this bright. Different games. Different styles. Same generation. Paige is fluid, surgical, smooth. Caitlin is explosive, relentless, loud in all the right ways. On paper, there's room for both. In reality, media rarely allows that. Every Caitlin headline invites a Paige question. Every Paige update sparks a Caitlin comparison, even when one isn't present. And that's what made this camp so uncomfortable for people paying close attention. Paige wasn't competing. She wasn't struggling. She wasn't even on the floor. Yet her name hovered in the background of everything Caitlin did. Analysts didn't say it directly, but the implication was clear. If Caitlin looks like this right now, what does that mean for everyone else waiting their turn? And waiting is the one thing elite athletes hate doing, especially when you've already proven who you are. But basketball doesn't care about resumes. It cares about timing, and timing was starting to lean heavily in one direction. There's an uncomfortable truth about elite basketball that fans don't always want to admit. It's not fair. It's not patient. And it doesn't pause. Team USA isn't built on potential. It's built on readiness. Camps are short. Windows are tight. Coaches don't have months to experiment. They need clarity fast. Paige Bueckers has never lacked talent. That's never been the issue. But injuries don't just affect bodies. They affect timelines, momentum, rhythm. While Paige was still navigating recovery and uncertainty, Caitlin walked into camp healthy, confident, and immediately effective. That contrast matters more than people realize. Not because coaches doubt Paige, but because certainty is currency. And Caitlin was offering it in bulk. Every drill reinforced the same thing. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't forcing. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply playing. And when a player looks that comfortable in a high-stakes environment, decisions start making themselves. That's when frustration quietly builds. Not from jealousy, but from knowing you didn't even get the chance to compete in the moment that mattered. And then chemistry made it worse. Basketball chemistry is rare. Real chemistry is even rarer. It's not just knowing where a teammate will be. It's trusting they'll be there before you even look. And Caitlin Clark walked into Team USA camp with that already built. Aaliyah Boston. They didn't need introductions. They didn't need time. Their connection was immediate and obvious. Pick and rolls flowed naturally. Transition reads were automatic. Timing felt rehearsed even though it wasn't. Coaches noticed. Immediately. Because here's the reality of short camps. If something works instantly, you don't overthink it. Other guards had flashes. Good moments. Solid sequences. Caitlin had structure. Continuity. Reliability. Every time she pushed the pace, Boston ran. Every time Boston sealed, Caitlin delivered. No hesitation. No second-guessing. That kind of connection doesn't just earn minutes, it earns trust. And once trust is established, roles start locking in. That's when the narrative quietly changed from competition to configuration. Who fits where? Who complements whom? Who makes the whole thing smoother? And smooth always wins. But not everyone benefits when decisions become obvious. Here's where headlines get lazy. Frustration doesn't always mean slammed doors or heated quotes. Sometimes it's internal. Silent. Calculated. It's watching a hierarchy form without you. It's seeing chemistry celebrated while you're still rehabbing. It's knowing you didn't lose ground, but someone else gained it fast. Paige Bueckers didn't get outplayed in this camp. She simply wasn't part of the moment that shifted perception. And perception is brutal. Fans don't remember timelines. They remember impressions. And Caitlin's impression was overwhelming. That's why the phrase, walks out in frustration sticks, even without footage. It captures a feeling, not an event. The feeling of watching control slip without touching the ball. And then the media did what it always does. It amplified it. Media narratives move faster than athletes can correct them. Once a story forms, it repeats. Once it repeats, it sticks. And once it sticks, it becomes truth in the eyes of the public. Caitlin Clark became the engine. Paige Bueckers became the question. Not because Paige declined, but because Caitlin surged at the perfect moment. Every highlight reinforced the same idea. Every quote nudged the same conclusion. Even neutral coverage leaned in one direction. And that's dangerous territory for any player trying to reassert themselves. Because at some point, talent stops being the loudest voice. Momentum does. And momentum was wearing number 22. But this story isn't finished yet. Not even close. Because frustration doesn't end careers. It sharpens them. Paige Bueckers has been counted out before. And every single time, she's found a way back into the conversation. That's why this moment matters more than people realize. Because this wasn't a collapse. It wasn't failure. And it definitely wasn't a loss of ability. What happened here was something far more dangerous for everyone else. Paige got a warning. Not from words. Not from coaches. Not from social media. From momentum. In elite basketball, momentum doesn't ask if you're ready. It doesn't check your resume. It doesn't care how much respect you've earned in the past. It moves forward, and it forces everyone else to either catch up or get left behind. And this camp showed Paige exactly where that momentum is heading. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel open-ended. It felt directional, structured, leaning one way. That realization hits harder than any criticism ever could. Because criticism can be dismissed. Doubt can be challenged. But clarity? Clarity forces action. Paige didn't lose her standing in one camp. What she lost was ambiguity. The comfortable gray area where talent alone keeps doors open. Now the path is visible. And it's narrow. This is the moment elite athletes either sharpen or fade. Not publicly, internally. This is where training shifts. Where urgency creeps into every rep. Where patience runs out. Paige understands this better than most. She knows the league isn't waiting. She knows Team USA doesn't pause. She knows the next opportunity won't reset the board. It'll build on this one. And that knowledge changes everything. Because when an athlete like Paige stops operating on hope and starts operating on precision, the response isn't loud. It's lethal. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the moment her story stopped being theoretical. And that's why what comes next should worry everyone who thinks this hierarchy is settled. Injuries don't just sideline players. They rewrite how people talk about them. For Paige Bueckers, that's been the quiet battle no highlight reel shows. Every time her name comes up in elite basketball discussions, it's followed by hesitation. Not doubt, but caution. And caution is dangerous. Because caution changes expectations. It lowers them just enough to feel reasonable, but high enough to feel suffocating. When she's healthy, if she can stay on the floor, assuming everything lines up, those phrases don't sound harsh. But over time, they stick. They become part of a player's identity, whether she accepts them or not. Paige didn't choose that narrative. It formed around her while she was doing everything right, rehabbing, rebuilding, preparing. And while she was doing that work quietly, Caitlin Clark walked into Team USA camp and erased her own injury questions in a single week. That contrast mattered more than any stat line. Because injuries don't scare coaches as much as uncertainty does. And Caitlin removed uncertainty instantly. No limping adjustments. No hesitation on cuts. No protected minutes. Just movement. Confidence. Flow. Meanwhile, Paige's absence kept her injury narrative alive by default. Not because it was fair, but because it was unresolved. That's the cruel part of timing. You don't have to be injured to be affected by injury history. All it takes is someone else stepping forward while you're still rebuilding. Paige knows this. She's not naive. She understands that availability isn't just physical, it's symbolic. And that's why this moment digs deeper than people think. Because Paige isn't just fighting to be healthy again. She's fighting to reclaim how she's perceived. To remind decision-makers that durability isn't a question mark, it's a phase. That setbacks aren't a pattern, they're chapters. But perception doesn't change through explanation. It changes through dominance. And that's the task now. Not to return, not to flash, but to overwhelm the conversation so completely that qualifiers disappear. That's the standard momentum has set. And Paige knows it. Which is why the next time she steps onto this stage, she won't be playing to prove she belongs. She'll be playing to remove doubt entirely. Because in elite basketball, the most dangerous player isn't the one with the loudest hype. It's the one who comes back with something to correct. At the Team USA level, basketball stops being about raw talent pretty quickly. Every player in that gym can score. Every player has accolades. Every player has been the one somewhere else. So coaches stop asking who is good and start asking who is safe. Safe doesn't mean conservative. It means dependable under pressure. When you only have a short window to prepare, when practices are limited, and when international competition punishes hesitation, coaches become obsessed with one thing above all else: decision compression. They want players who reduce the number of decisions everyone else has to make. That's where Caitlin Clark separated herself so quickly. Every possession with her on the floor felt organized. Not scripted, organized. Teammates didn't hesitate on cuts because they trusted the timing. Bigs didn't overthink seals because they knew the pass would come if it was there. Shooters spaced with confidence instead of doubt. That doesn't show up in box scores. But to coaches, it's everything. Because when a point guard removes hesitation, the entire system speeds up without forcing anything. And speed without chaos is the gold standard of international basketball. This is why highlight debates don't matter inside those gyms. A coach doesn't care that 3 different players can hit tough shots. They care which one ensures the right shot happens consistently. Caitlin made practices easier to run. That's a massive advantage. She wasn't calling attention to herself. She wasn't forcing leadership. She wasn't trying to win camp. She was simply making the game feel predictable, in the best possible way. And once a coach feels that, they start protecting it. Because every alternative feels riskier by comparison. That's the uncomfortable part for everyone else. Paige Bueckers, when healthy, brings brilliance, creativity, flow. But brilliance requires freedom, and freedom requires time. International camps don't offer much of that. They reward structure. So this wasn't a rejection of Paige's game. It was a reflection of the environment. And environments decide careers faster than talent ever does. Once Caitlin showed she could compress complexity into clarity, the evaluation shifted. It stopped being about who could grow into a role, and became about who already owned one. That's when roster conversations harden. Not loudly, quietly. Locker rooms don't respond to hype. They respond to certainty. When players walk into a shared space like Team USA camp, they're scanning constantly. Not for stars, but for anchors. Who steadies things when drills get sloppy. Who speaks without over-explaining. Who makes the game feel easier instead of heavier. That's how hierarchy forms before a single lineup is announced. Caitlin Clark filled that role almost immediately. Not through volume. Not through speeches. Through rhythm. She played with a calm that transferred. When she pushed pace, teammates followed instinctively. When she slowed things down, nobody questioned it. That's not obedience, that's trust. And trust is contagious. Other players started cutting harder because effort felt rewarded. Defensive rotations tightened because communication felt clear. Small moments stacked into a sense of order. That order changes everything. Because when a locker room feels organized, players stop worrying about proving themselves and start worrying about contributing. That's the shift coaches want. And once it happens, it's incredibly difficult to undo. Now imagine entering that environment later. Not stepping into neutrality, but into a system that already hums. That's the invisible challenge Paige faces. It's not that she wouldn't be welcomed. She would. It's that her presence would require adjustment, rebalancing, new reads, new rhythms. And coaches hesitate to disrupt stability unless the upside is overwhelming. That's not personal. That's strategic. This is why chemistry matters more than fans realize. It's not about friendship. It's about friction, or the lack of it. Caitlin reduced friction. She didn't dominate personalities. She streamlined them. And once a locker room feels streamlined, any change, even a positive one, feels risky. This is how players can lose leverage without losing respect. Paige didn't fall out of favor. She simply wasn't part of the initial alignment. An alignment, once established, becomes the invisible ruler of everything that follows. That's why frustration can exist without conflict. Why tension can exist without words. Why silence can be louder than reactions. Because everyone in that room felt it. The game felt settled. And unsettled systems don't like being settled without you. Paige has missed moments before. She's dealt with adversity. This isn't new territory for her. But this moment was different. This wasn't college. This wasn't branding. This wasn't hype. This was the beginning of a long-term international core forming in real time. World Cups, Olympics, multi-year planning. And Caitlin didn't just enter that conversation, she anchored it. That's why this camp mattered more than past ones. The age curve, the timeline, the transition of leadership. Team USA is quietly passing the torch. And torches don't get passed ceremonially. They get taken by whoever's ready when the lights are on. Caitlin was ready. Paige wasn't present. And that reality stings, no matter how composed you are. Paige Bueckers has faced adversity before. She's missed games. She's fought back from injuries. She's heard the whispers and answered them on the court. But this moment felt different, and deep down she knew it. Because this wasn't just about recovery anymore. It wasn't about proving she could still play at an elite level. This moment was about positioning. For years, Paige existed in a space where her talent alone kept her central to every future projection. Even when she wasn't playing, she was assumed. Assumed to return. Assumed to reclaim ground. Assumed to reinsert herself seamlessly. That assumption quietly disappeared here. Not through criticism. Not through doubt. But through replacement of uncertainty. Caitlin Clark didn't challenge Paige directly. She did something more disruptive. She made alternatives unnecessary. And that's why this moment landed heavier than any injury ever could. Because injuries invite sympathy. Momentum invites replacement. Team USA isn't built to wait. It's built to move forward with whoever stabilizes the present. And for the first time, Paige wasn't the default future. She was the variable. That realization doesn't sting immediately. It settles in slowly. It shows up in the way conversations shift, in the way questions are framed, in the way decisions feel less open-ended than before. This wasn't the first time Paige had been absent. It was the first time her absence didn't feel temporary. And for an athlete who's always lived at the center of the game, that's a seismic internal shift. Because when the door stops waiting for you, urgency stops being optional. This is the moment when elite players stop thinking about coming back and start thinking about how they're coming back. Sharper, more decisive, less forgiving of delay. Paige didn't lose confidence here. She lost comfort. And losing comfort is often the first step toward something dangerous. Media narratives don't start loud. They start subtle. A headline here. A comparison there. A question framed just slightly differently. Over time, those small shifts compound into identity. That's what happened here. Caitlin Clark stopped being discussed as one of the future stars and started being discussed as the structure, the organizer, the engine, the piece everything else connects to. Paige Bueckers, without doing anything wrong, started being discussed as context. When she returns, when she's ready, when she fits into this, that's not disrespect, but it is repositioning. And once the media repositions a player, it becomes incredibly difficult to reclaim narrative control without overwhelming performance. Because media doesn't like ambiguity. It fills gaps quickly. Caitlyn's dominance gave analysts clarity. Paige's absence left space. And space always gets filled by whoever is visible. What makes this particularly dangerous is that these narratives don't stay in the media. They bleed into fan expectations. They bleed into commentary. They bleed into pressure placed on coaches. Even when decision-makers swear they ignore noise, they absorb framing. Everyone does. So when Paige returns, she won't be stepping into neutral coverage. She'll be stepping into a story already mid-sentence. Every good game will be framed as she's back. Every bad stretch will be framed as still adjusting. Every comparison will feel like a referendum. That weight is invisible, but heavy. Meanwhile, Caitlyn gets the opposite benefit. Her mistakes will be framed as leadership growing pains. Her struggles as normal fluctuations. Her dominance as confirmation. That's the advantage momentum creates. Not favoritism, insulation. And insulation allows players to play free. Paige, by contrast, will be playing precise. And precision under pressure is exhausting. This is why media narratives are often more impactful than coaching decisions. Because they shape the emotional environment players compete inside. Paige doesn't just need to perform. She needs to overwrite a story already in motion. And that takes something extraordinary. Which is exactly why this moment matters so much. Because the next time Paige steps onto this stage, she won't be answering questions about her game. She'll be answering questions about her place. This is the moment that separates elite players from era-defining ones. Not the comeback. Not the highlight. Not the applause. The response. Paige Bueckers is now standing at a crossroads most players never reach. Not because of talent, but because of timing. Her next stretch of basketball won't be evaluated as a return. It'll be evaluated as a correction. That's a different psychological weight. Because corrections aren't about showing flashes. They're about removing doubt so completely that the conversation stops. Paige knows this. She knows that when she steps back onto this stage, she won't be competing against expectations. She'll be competing against momentum. And momentum doesn't argue. It just keeps moving. This changes how everything is approached. Training isn't about getting back into shape anymore. It's about sharpening edges. About compressing decision-making. About eliminating moments where hesitation can be interpreted as weakness. Every rep matters now. Because Paige isn't just reintroducing herself to the game. She's reintroducing herself to a system that has already moved forward. And that's uncomfortable. Because systems don't adjust easily. They resist disruption. They prefer familiarity. So Paige's task isn't just to play well. It's to be undeniable. Undeniable in pace. Undeniable in efficiency. Undeniable in control. Not louder than Caitlyn, but different enough that the system has to stretch. That's the hardest thing to do in elite basketball. Because the better a system functions, the less it wants to change. Paige understands that if she returns and blends in, she loses ground. But if she returns and forces decisions, she regains leverage. That's the razor-thin margin she's operating inside. And players who survive this margin don't just come back. They transform. This is the phase where legacies quietly pivot, where preparation becomes obsessive, where comfort is treated like an enemy. Paige isn't chasing relevance. She's chasing control. And when a player of her caliber starts moving with that level of intent, the league notices, whether it wants to or not. The next camp won't feel like competition. It'll feel like confrontation, even if no one says a word, because everyone will understand what's at stake. Paige won't be evaluated on potential. Caitlyn won't be evaluated on upside. Both will be evaluated on command. Every drill will feel heavier. Every lineup choice will feel louder. Every substitution will feel intentional. And the coaches will feel it too. Because now, there's something they didn't have before. Tension between continuity and disruption. Caitlyn represents continuity. Stability. Flow. Paige represents disruption. Possibility. Adjustment. Both are valuable, but rarely at the same time. That's why the next camp won't just test skill. It'll test philosophy. Do you preserve what works? Or do you reshape to accommodate what could redefine it? Those decisions don't happen in meetings. They happen in moments. Who initiates late possessions? Who directs traffic without being told? Who teammates instinctively follow when plays break down? Those moments decide everything. And here's what makes it uncomfortable. Both players will be right. Caitlyn will be right for keeping things organized. Paige will be right for demanding space to create. There's no villain here. No wrong answer. Just pressure. And pressure exposes everything. It exposes how adaptable leaders are. It exposes how flexible systems can be. It exposes how much patience really exists. That's why this next phase matters more than any single game. Because the outcome won't just affect rosters, it'll define identity. What kind of team is this going to be? Who does it belong to? And how much risk is it willing to absorb? Those questions don't stay theoretical forever. They demand answers. And when they do, silence won't be an option anymore. USA Basketball never announces its leaders. There's no ceremony, no press release, no official declaration. Leadership is decided in moments that never make the broadcast. It shows up in who teammates look toward when a drill breaks down, in who adjusts spacing without being asked, in who speaks once and doesn't need to repeat it. That's how real authority forms. At this camp, Caitlin Clark didn't ask for that role. She didn't campaign for it. She didn't try to dominate the room. She simply made the environment easier to operate inside. And that's the fastest way to earn leadership at the international level. Because USA Basketball isn't built around stars, it's built around systems. And systems gravitate toward whoever stabilizes them. Every time Caitlin initiated an action, it felt decisive. Not rushed. Not forced. Just clear. Teammates didn't second-guess reads because the reads made sense. Coaches didn't intervene because nothing needed correcting. That's when leadership becomes invisible. And invisible leadership is the strongest kind. Once a player starts functioning that way, the staff stops evaluating them as an option. They start treating them as a constant. Lineups begin forming around that presence. Conversations shift from who should start to who complements best. That's a massive jump, and it happens quietly. Meanwhile, players who aren't there don't get removed. They simply stop being referenced in those early constructions. That's how leverage disappears without confrontation. Paige Bueckers wasn't replaced in name. She was replaced in assumption. And assumptions drive planning. USA Basketball doesn't like chaos. They don't want emotional leaders. They want stabilizers. People who compress decision-making under pressure and make outcomes feel predictable. Caitlin checked that box immediately. And once leadership is felt rather than declared, it becomes extremely hard to redistribute. Because now, removing that presence would create uncertainty, something coaches avoid at all costs. That's the unspoken truth of elite basketball leadership. You don't win it by being the best player. You win it by making everyone else better without making it obvious. And that's what shifted during this camp. Fans love the idea of multiple superstars sharing control. Coaches don't. At the highest levels, clarity beats abundance every time. International basketball doesn't allow room for overlapping authority. Possessions are short. Spacing is tight. Mistakes are punished instantly. That's why coaches hate ambiguity in leadership roles. When two players both believe they should initiate, someone hesitates. When two players expect the ball late, timing slips. When two players command attention, spacing collapses. It doesn't matter how talented they are. The system suffers. This is why teams quietly choose one engine. One player who dictates tempo. One voice that overrides confusion. One decision-maker everyone defers to instinctively. At this camp, that engine became Caitlin. Not because Paige couldn't be won, but because systems rarely tolerate dual command structures. Paige's game thrives on flow, creativity, freedom. She reads the defense organically. She adapts in real time. That style is lethal, but it requires space to breathe. International systems don't breathe much. They're rigid by necessity. They reward predictability, not improvisation. So when Caitlin established herself as the organizer, the system naturally tightened around her. Plays flowed through her. Timing synced to her pace. Teammates adjusted to her rhythm. Once that happens, inserting another engine becomes risky. Not impossible, but disruptive. And coaches hate disruption unless it offers a clearly superior outcome. That's the bind Paige faces. To reclaim central control, she doesn't just have to be great. She has to be clearly worth restructuring the engine around. That's an insanely high bar, especially when the current system is already winning internally. This isn't about ego. It's about efficiency. Coaches would rather maximize one engine than manage two. And once that preference forms, coexistence becomes conditional, not assumed. That's why this moment matters so much. Because if Paige returns and blends in, the engine stays the same. If she returns and disrupts, the entire system must respond. Both paths are difficult. Only one restores leverage. And that's why this next phase isn't just competitive, it's strategic. Officially, coaches will always tell you the same thing. They don't care about noise. They don't read comments. They don't feel pressure from fans. That's the public answer. The private reality is more complicated. Because while coaches don't let fans make decisions, fan pressure absolutely narrows the margin for error. And right now, Caitlin Clark sits at the center of one of the largest fan movements women's basketball has ever seen. That matters. Not because she's protected, but because removing or sidelining her becomes a statement, whether coaches want it to be or not. Every decision involving Caitlin is amplified. Every lineup choice is dissected. Every minute distribution is analyzed. That scrutiny changes risk tolerance. Coaches start asking different questions. What happens if we sit her? How does that look? What message does that send? Those questions don't override basketball logic, but they shape the consequences of basketball decisions. And consequences matter. Caitlin didn't create that pressure. She inherited it. And once a player becomes the face of momentum, coaches don't just evaluate performance, they evaluate fallout. That's the hidden layer of modern basketball. Paige doesn't benefit from that insulation right now. If she struggles, the narrative will say she's still adjusting. If Caitlin struggles, the narrative will say it's part of leadership growth. That difference isn't favoritism. It's momentum bias. And momentum bias doesn't disappear just because coaches want to be objective. It exists because attention exists. USA Basketball is now operating in an era where decisions ripple beyond the gym. Sponsors, broadcasts, future audiences, all of it is connected. So when Caitlin locks down the engine roll, it doesn't just simplify basketball. It simplifies optics. And coaches value that more than they'll ever admit. That's the uncomfortable reality Paige is stepping back into. Not a fair fight, but a visible one. Let's be clear, because this is where narratives get lazy. This isn't jealousy. This isn't personal. This isn't a feud. There's no animosity between Paige and Caitlin. What exists is structural tension. Two players built to lead. One system designed for clarity. One timeline that doesn't slow down. That combination creates pressure whether emotions are involved or not. Paige doesn't resent Caitlin. Caitlin doesn't feel threatened by Paige. They're operating inside a system that can only elevate one organizing force at a time. And that's where tension lives. Not in feelings, but in function. Paige's game is expressive, adaptive, creative. She thrives when the system bends around her instincts. Caitlin's game is directive, force-multiplying, structural. She thrives when the system follows her tempo. Both are elite. Both are correct. But systems don't like dual philosophies. So this isn't about one player wanting more shine. It's about fit under pressure. And fit is unforgiving. That's why this moment feels heavier than rivalry talk. Because neither player is wrong. They're just early. Early to a moment that will eventually demand a choice. And choices at this level don't happen cleanly. They unfold over camps, over rotations, over subtle changes in trust. This is why silence has dominated this storyline. Because everyone involved understands that speaking too soon would only harden positions. The real battle isn't emotional. It's architectural. Who does the system bend around when stakes peak? That answer hasn't been finalized yet. But the blueprint is starting to show. And that's why this moment matters. When Paige Bueckers finally steps back into this environment, it won't feel like a comeback. It'll feel like an audit. Every movement will be observed differently. Not because people doubt her, but because the system has already learned how to function without her. That's the hardest position an elite player can enter. Paige won't be judged on whether she looks good. She'll be judged on whether she changes anything. Whether the floor opens differently. Whether tempo bends. Whether teammates instinctively defer or hesitate. Those reactions matter more than stats. Because coaches aren't watching Paige versus the defense. They're watching Paige versus the system. Does the offense breathe easier with her initiating? Does spacing stretch or compress? Do reads accelerate or multiply? Those answers arrive quickly. And here's where pressure becomes surgical. If Paige dominates the ball and slows rhythm, questions form. If she plays off-ball too comfortably, doubts grow about her role. If she blends too smoothly, she risks disappearing into structure. There is no neutral outcome. Every version of Paige will be interpreted as a statement. That's exhausting, but it's also clarifying. Because Paige won't be fighting Caitlin directly. She'll be fighting precedent. The precedent that says this system already works. The precedent that says chemistry has been established. The precedent that says disruption must justify itself. That's a brutal reality for someone whose game thrives on freedom. Which means Paige's return won't be cautious. It can't be. She won't be proving she's back. She'll be proving she's necessary. And necessity is the hardest thing to demonstrate without forcing the issue. That's why this moment is so dangerous. Because Paige isn't the kind of player who fades quietly. She adjusts. And when she adjusts with purpose, the environment has to respond. There will be a moment, and it won't be announced. It won't come with a countdown. It won't be labeled as decisive. But everyone in the gym will feel it. A possession where the game tightens. A sequence where tempo wobbles. A stretch where leadership needs to be instinctive. That's when systems reveal their truth. Who gets the ball without asking? Who teammates look at when a play breaks down? Who initiates without hesitation? That moment will choose more than a lineup. It will choose direction. Because once the pressure spikes, coaches stop experimenting. They go with whoever makes the next decision feel obvious. That's the invisible test Caitlin has already passed. And that's the test Paige will have to confront head-on. Not with words. Not with reputation. But with control. Control of pace. Control of reads. Control of emotional gravity. Because leadership under pressure isn't about dominance. It's about inevitability. When one player feels inevitable in tight moments, everyone else becomes adjustable. That's what's on the line. Not pride. Not headlines. Not rivalry narratives. But ownership of the moment that matters most. And once ownership is established in that moment, it carries forward. Into rotations. Into trust. Into future planning. That's why this story hasn't peaked yet. It's still approaching the decision point. And when that moment arrives, it won't explode. It'll settle. Quietly. Decisively. Most rivalries fade once roles are defined. This one won't. Because this isn't a rivalry built on trash talk or animosity. It's built on collision. Two careers moving at full speed toward the same limited space. And that kind of collision doesn't resolve cleanly. There won't be a single game that settles this. There won't be one camp that ends the debate. There won't be a final verdict everyone agrees on. What's coming is impact, sustained, compounding impact. Every decision from here forward will echo. Every rotation will be interpreted. Every moment of success will be weighed against the other. Not because fans demand it, but because the system forces it. USA basketball isn't choosing between personalities. It's choosing between architectures. One built around structure and tempo. One built around adaptability and creativity. Both can win. Both have proven it. But systems don't like indecision. So instead of resolving this rivalry, the program will stress test it. They'll let both paths run until one bends under pressure. That's why this story feels unfinished. Because it is. Paige and Caitlin aren't competing for approval. They're competing for inevitability. Who becomes the player the system turns to without discussion? Who becomes the option teammates trust without confirmation? Who becomes the answer before the question is asked? Those things don't happen all at once. They happen gradually, through accumulated moments. And once that accumulation reaches critical mass, resolution doesn't happen. Dominance does. That's why this rivalry isn't approaching closure. It's approaching consequence. Frustration gets misunderstood. People think frustration means anger, or resentment, or emotional instability. That's not what this is. This kind of frustration is internal alignment snapping into focus. It's the moment when an elite competitor realizes something meaningful has shifted, and accepts that the response must be equally meaningful. Paige's frustration isn't about Caitlin. It's about lost neutrality, the luxury of being assumed, the comfort of open-ended futures, the safety of knowing time would wait. Those things quietly disappeared here. And once they're gone, they don't come back. That's when frustration becomes fuel. Not loud fuel. Focused fuel. The kind that changes routines. That shortens timelines. That eliminates indulgence. This is the frustration that sharpens preparation into obsession. Paige isn't angry. She's activated. Activated by clarity. Activated by urgency. Activated by the realization that waiting is no longer an option. That's dangerous for everyone else. Because players who operate from frustration rooted in clarity don't play reactively. They play decisively. They stop asking for space. They start taking it. And that's what makes this moment pivotal. Not because something broke, but because something locked in. Most basketball stories are short. They flare up around a game, a quote, or a highlight, and then fade once attention moves on. This one won't, because this story isn't anchored to a moment. It's anchored to a transition. Transitions don't resolve quickly. They stretch across seasons, across cycles, across decisions that don't seem connected until you look back. Years from now, people won't remember the drills from this camp. They won't remember who scored the most in practice. They won't even remember the exact headlines. What they'll remember is that this was the moment the future stopped being abstract. The moment where leadership, identity, and direction quietly aligned around one path and challenged another to respond. That's why this camp matters. Not because it crowned anyone, but because it revealed trajectory. Trajectory is far more powerful than results. Results can be overturned. Trajectories require force to change. And once a trajectory becomes visible, every decision after it is interpreted through that lens. That's what Paige and Caitlin are now operating inside. Every return, every absence, every performance. Nothing exists in isolation anymore. This isn't about who's better. It's about who defines the shape of what comes next. And those stories don't end quickly. They echo. Caitlin Clark didn't dominate this moment with noise. She dominated it with certainty. Certainty of role, certainty of rhythm, certainty of direction. And certainty is the rarest currency in elite basketball. Paige Bueckers didn't lose ground here. She lost invisibility, the luxury of moving without comparison, the comfort of open timelines, the safety of being assumed rather than evaluated. That loss hurts, but it also clarifies, because clarity forces choice. Paige now knows exactly what she's responding to, exactly what she's walking back into, exactly what she has to reclaim, not symbolically, but structurally. And Caitlin now knows the weight she carries, not just as a scorer, not just as a star, but as the player the system bends around. That weight doesn't disappear. It compounds. This is the moment before the moment, the inhale before consequence, the quiet before definition. Nothing exploded here, but everything moved. And once things start moving at this level, they don't drift back to neutral. They accelerate. Olympic teams aren't built on highlight nights. They're built on trust accumulated slowly, quietly, and relentlessly. By the time the Olympics actually arrive, most of the real decisions have already been made, not publicly, but structurally. Roles are assumed. Hierarchies are internalized. Expectations are fixed. And moments like this camp are where those invisible decisions begin. USA Basketball doesn't just evaluate talent in Olympic cycles. They evaluate reliability under compression. The ability to function when preparation time is short, chemistry windows are tight, and mistakes carry global consequences. That's why Caitlin Clark's timing mattered so much. She didn't just show she could perform. She showed she could stabilize. Stability is the single most valuable trait in an Olympic context. When coaches look ahead to 2028, they aren't imagining individual performances. They're imagining stress scenarios. Gold medal games, hostile crowds, momentum swings. They ask one question: who makes chaos feel manageable? Caitlin answered that question without being asked. And once a player does that, they stop being evaluated as a candidate. They become a placeholder, a default, a known quantity in a future that hasn't happened yet. That's how Olympic cores form. Not from dominance, from predictability. Paige Bueckers understands this better than most. She knows Olympic cycles don't reset each year. They compound. Every camp either reinforces trust or forces doubt. Missing one camp doesn't disqualify you, but it allows someone else to solidify assumptions. That's the quiet danger of timing. Because once assumptions lock in, they don't dissolve easily. They get reinforced by repetition, by comfort, by the absence of contradiction. This camp wasn't a coronation. It was the first brick. And Olympic structures are built brick by brick, long before anyone notices the wall. Peak talent is intoxicating, but momentum is operational. And in Olympic basketball, operations beat potential every time. Coaches don't want to gamble on ceiling. They want to minimize downside. They want to know that when pressure hits, the system won't wobble. Momentum creates that confidence. Caitlin Clark isn't just playing well right now. She's stacking continuity. Each successful integration makes the next one easier. Each camp reduces uncertainty. That's how momentum compounds. Meanwhile, Paige Bueckers doesn't suffer from lack of talent. She suffers from interrupted rhythm. Not because of fault, but because momentum is fragile. When momentum stalls, re-entry becomes harder than initial ascent. That's the paradox elite players face. Being great once doesn't guarantee immediate leverage later. Systems don't wait for peaks, they align around flow. Paige's challenge isn't to reach her peak again. It's to interrupt momentum already in motion. And that's harder than starting from scratch. Because now, coaches aren't comparing Paige to Caitlin as individuals. They're comparing certainty to disruption. And disruption has to justify itself. This doesn't mean Paige can't reclaim ground. It means the bar has moved. She doesn't just need to be excellent. She needs to change outcomes, not just enhance them. That's the cost of momentum. Caitlin benefits from being the player the system already knows how to use. Paige must prove that the system becomes better by bending again. That's an incredibly high standard, and one only truly elite players can meet. Which is why this phase of the story is so important. Because if Paige does reclaim momentum, it won't be subtle. It'll be seismic. And if she doesn't, the system will keep flowing forward without hesitation. Momentum doesn't pause for fairness. It rewards readiness. This is the scenario that quietly keeps decision-makers up at night. Not Paige returning. Not Paige playing well. But Paige reclaiming momentum. Because if that happens, everything that feels stable right now becomes negotiable again. Momentum doesn't just elevate a player. It reshapes environments. If Paige comes back fully healthy and immediately bends games to her will, the system is forced to ask uncomfortable questions. Not about talent, about structure. Does the offense feel freer with her initiating? Do teammates respond differently to her reads? Does pace adjust, not slow, but evolve? Those aren't theoretical questions. They're structural ones. And if the answers lean toward Paige, the system doesn't get to ignore it. This is why Paige's potential return is so volatile. Because she doesn't need to outscore Caitlin. She doesn't need to dominate headlines. She just needs to make the game feel different. Different enough that coaches can't pretend continuity is the only option. And that's terrifying for systems built on stability. If Paige reclaims momentum, USA basketball faces a dilemma it can't postpone. Do you preserve what works, or do you evolve to accommodate something that might work better? That's not a choice coaches enjoy making. Because evolution introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty carries risk. But refusing to evolve carries its own danger, stagnation. That's the knife's edge this program would find itself on. Paige reclaiming momentum wouldn't just reinsert her into the hierarchy. It would destabilize it. And destabilization is where power shifts happen. That's why this scenario matters more than anything that's happened so far. Because if Paige does seize momentum, it won't be incremental. It will force a reckoning. On paper, coexistence sounds easy. Two elite players. One shared goal. Plenty of talent to go around. Reality is far messier. Coexistence isn't about skill overlap, it's about decision authority. Who initiates when options collapse? Who controls tempo when momentum swings? Who absorbs responsibility when things go wrong? Those answers can't be shared evenly. They must be clear. And that's why coexistence between two engines is so difficult. Caitlin's game centralizes control. Paige's game decentralizes it. Neither approach is wrong. But systems rarely thrive trying to do both simultaneously. When a system bends two ways, it snaps under pressure. That's why coaches quietly resist coexistence narratives. They understand what fans don't. Late-game possessions don't allow philosophical balance. They demand hierarchy. Someone decides. Someone follows. And the more important the moment, the less flexible that hierarchy becomes. So coexistence, if it happens, requires sacrifice. One player initiates less. One player adapts rhythm. One player accepts reduced control. That's not a downgrade. But it feels like one to elite competitors. And that's where tension lives. Not in ego, in identity. Paige has never been a passenger. Caitlin has never been secondary. Asking either to fully yield is asking them to become something they've never needed to be. That's why coexistence isn't the default outcome. It's the hardest one. And it's why this story keeps pointing toward a moment of choice rather than compromise. Because systems don't drift into coexistence. They are forced into it, or they reject it. And whichever direction USA basketball takes will define this era. No matter how careful everyone is, silence never lasts forever. At some point, the media forces clarity. Not because reporters want drama, but because narratives demand direction. Once a story reaches a certain size, it stops being optional. Questions become sharper. Framing becomes unavoidable. And this story has already crossed that threshold. Right now, coverage still sounds polite, analytical, measured. But listen closely, and you can hear the pressure building underneath it. Who's the leader? Who closes games? Who does the offense belong to? Those questions don't stay hypothetical. Eventually, someone asks them directly. Maybe it's during a press conference. Maybe it's after a tight game. Maybe it's a quote taken out of context. That's when things shift. Because once a player is publicly framed as the option, every other role gets redefined automatically. And that's where this gets uncomfortable. If Caitlin is framed as the engine, Paige becomes the adjustment. If Paige is framed as the answer, Caitlin becomes the question. Media doesn't mean to do this, but it always does. And once those frames are established, they're hard to escape. Players feel it. Coaches feel it. Even teammates feel it. Every pass becomes symbolic. Every possession gets interpreted. Every lineup choice feels intentional, even when it isn't. That's why coaches try to delay these moments as long as possible. But they can't stop them forever. Because the bigger the audience gets, the smaller the margin for ambiguity becomes. And women's basketball is growing faster than ever. More eyes mean more pressure. More pressure means fewer gray areas. At some point, someone will be asked a question they can't sidestep. And that answer, no matter how neutral it sounds, will be treated like a verdict. That's when the rivalry becomes public instead of structural. And once it's public, everything accelerates. This moment doesn't just feel bigger because of the players. It feels bigger because of the era. Women's basketball is no longer fighting for attention. It has it. And attention changes everything. Games are being dissected in real time. Clips go viral instantly. Opinions form before context catches up. That environment amplifies pressure in ways previous generations never dealt with. In the past, internal hierarchy stayed internal. Now it leaks immediately. And that makes moments like this heavier. Caitlin Clark isn't just performing inside a system. She's carrying visibility. Paige Bueckers isn't just returning from injury. She's returning into a spotlight that never turns off. That combination is new. USA Basketball isn't just selecting players anymore. It's shaping narratives. It's influencing how the next generation sees leadership, dominance, and control. Every decision sends a message. And those messages echo far beyond the court. That's why this era feels volatile. Because the stakes aren't just medals. They're identity. Who represents this program? What style defines it? What kind of leadership does it value? Those questions used to take years to answer. Now they get debated overnight. And that compression makes everything feel urgent. Paige and Caitlin aren't just navigating competition. They're navigating a moment in the sport's evolution where nothing stays quiet for long. That's why patience feels thinner. Why narratives harden faster. Why momentum matters more than ever. This isn't just a rivalry. It's a case study in how modern sports power gets decided. And that's what makes this moment unforgettable. 10 years from now, people won't argue about who was better. They'll argue about who controlled the era. Moments like this camp quietly decide that. Not with drama, not with confrontation, but with alignment. And right now, alignment favors Caitlin. That doesn't mean it stays that way. But it explains why everything feels heavier than it looks. This rivalry isn't ending. It's maturing. Caitlin is stepping into leadership. Paige is preparing a response. Both paths are valid. Only one can dominate at a time. And that's what makes what's coming next impossible to ignore. Let's end one misconception clearly. Nobody got embarrassed. That word gets clicks, but it misses the truth. What happened at Team USA camp was something far more impactful. A recalibration. A shift in certainty. Caitlin Clark didn't outshine someone standing next to her. She stepped into a vacuum and filled it completely. And in elite basketball, vacuums don't stay open long. Paige Bueckers didn't respond publicly. No cryptic posts. No subtle quotes. No visible frustration. And that restraint matters. Because elite competitors don't waste energy narrating moments they plan to answer later. Silence isn't surrender. It's preparation. And anyone who's followed Paige long enough knows she doesn't disappear. She recalibrates. This is what progress looks like. Not comfort. Not harmony. But pressure. Two generational players colliding with timing, not talent. One riding momentum. One preparing response. This isn't conflict, it's evolution. And women's basketball is better because of it. The next camp will feel different. The expectations will be sharper. The questions more direct. The patience thinner. Paige won't be evaluated as potential anymore. She'll be evaluated as impact. And Caitlin won't be evaluated as a breakout. She'll be evaluated as a leader. That's when stories stop being speculative and start becoming defining. Years from now, this moment won't live in highlight reels. It'll live in context. The moment Team USA's future stopped being theoretical. The moment leadership stopped rotating. The moment timing picked a direction. And the moment someone else realized they'd have to respond, not wait. Caitlin Clark didn't change the game that day. She changed the order. Paige Bueckers didn't lose anything. She gained clarity. And clarity is dangerous when it belongs to someone elite. Because the next chapter won't be quiet. It'll be undeniable. If you want to stay ahead of where this era of women's basketball is really going, beyond the highlights, beyond the headlines, make sure you're subscribed. Because the biggest moments don't start with buzzer beaters, they start with shifts like this.